We have the ability to drink without you.
See if I can get Dan in here too.
We got a full house tonight. How many people do we have? 9, 10?
Yeah. Eric's he's having a Blake issue. His internet went out. So he may not be on, but yeah, the goal was 10. So filling up the StreamYard max there. That's why we could only have 4 Single Barrel Club folks in on it.
Nice.
Perfect.
Hey, we got everybody.
I think we got everyone. Cool. So
Yeah.
thanks everyone on the stream for joining us. We're super excited to have you. I think it's going to be a really fun hour, right? So we're going to take the next hour. We're going to be hanging out with the guys from Black Button Distilling and talking about the single barrel pick that we did, learn a little bit more about their operation, get your thoughts on the bottles, and we'll go from there. So to kick it off, I'm Jordan, one of the 3 guys from Breaking Bourbon. With me here is Nick. Third guy, Eric, is having some internet issues, but we're super excited to be here and hang out with all you all and chat and drink some good bourbon. And then with us, we also have our retailer partner. So Blake, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me. Most of you probably, if you watch all this stuff, may have seen me before, but I'm Blake from Bourboner and Steelbox. Always fun to jump in and join these live streams. Nick, Jordan, and Eric and I had a lot of fun picking this barrel, so we were really excited to be the retail partner on this one, and really like what Black Button's doing. Been following the whole Empire Rye for a while, so yeah, just happy to be a part of it tonight. Thanks for having me.
Sweet. And Alex, Jason, do you guys want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jason Barrett. I'm the founder and
myself out of the way
at Black Button Distilling. Started the company back in 2012 and oversee everything from floor mopping to mashing.
Yeah, Ben, I've been working with the company since about 2017 in our Buffalo region, as well as kind of helping this wild world of e-commerce that has jumped into kind of all the retail world, I think, for all the craft distilleries and major brands across the country. So it's been a very interesting 2020. I'll be happy to throw back a few bourbons here to get through the last couple weeks.
Awesome. So I guess really to just kick things off, I know we're here to learn more about Black Button, but also Nick, do you just want to tell everyone about the barrel that we selected?
Yeah, I'll tell a little bit here, and actually, is that all right? So I'll a little bit about.
Are you on mute?
We got some reverb there. See, Jordan, me and you, everyone else on mute.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that sounds okay. All right. So, talk a little bit about the barrel we picked, but actually, kind of the main point of this is that the 4 folks from the Single Barrel Club really want to hear what you guys think about it, and want to hear what the folks at Black Button, kind of the history and story behind, what is actually a barrel proof 4-grain bourbon. And, certainly we'll let the Black Button folks talk about this, but actually it hails from where our original hometown, not anymore, but Rochester, New York. So a little bit near and dear to the heart. So it's great to finally be connecting with these folks from Black Button who are right down the street from us now. Actually, I'm in Syracuse, New York, currently is where I live. Yeah, so I think what I want to do, let's have the guys from Black Button kind of kick it off. Let's go through a little bit of history of the distillery. I know Jason probably has some interesting things to say. I think he was, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but 24 years old when you actually founded the distillery, which is pretty crazy. I'm thinking about what I was doing at 24, and founding a distillery was definitely not anywhere in the wheelhouse of anything that I was thinking about doing. So let's do a little history, and then we'll taste the barrel. And then, and I want the guys, everybody who's on it, from the club, feel free, jump in with questions and interact. So I want this to be kind of a very interactive type of thing. We'll go for an hour. So it's 9:00 right now. We'll go till 10. So let me turn it over to Jason and Alex. So go ahead, guys. Tell us the story of Black Button.
So our story actually goes back to my college days. So I was a political science major, was researching prohibition, and during the research of that paper for my senior thesis, came to realize that although I couldn't buy beer, I could buy everything I needed to make beer. And I was a fairly industrious young man, and but I lived on the sixth floor of a dorm. But that didn't bother me, so I went up to Syracuse actually, and bought myself a homebrew kit. You know, nervous as all hell because it seemed like I was doing something wrong. Brought it back to my suite, brewed my first batch of beer. Literally, it was fermenting in my closet, and I knew nothing about what I was doing. Your typical college student, I only kind of read the directions. Sanitation was so important. The dorm shower was where I got the water to brew the beer. None of this was a good idea. But it became a pretty funny joke amongst my friends. And the beer was pretty bad, but we drank it anyway. And when I moved down to Washington, D.C., I ended up bringing the homebrew kit with me. And as I got a little older, I started to find I really enjoyed it as a hobby, and started reading actual books and going to the D.C. Homebrew Club. And eventually I got pretty good at it. I won a bunch of homebrewing awards. And so in 2010, 2011, I'm only a couple years out of school, but I've decided that I'm going to quit my job and open a brewery. But as I get looking around, there's a lot of space issues in DC, and I start looking further afield to see if I could buy an existing brewery. And I end up connecting with one down in North Carolina. It ends up not working out, but that brewery was always intended to be a brewery / distillery. And as I was going through the business plan of trying to resurrect this North Carolina brewery, I came to realize that distilling had a lot of the same things I loved about making beer, but at the end you got to have whiskey, which was pretty awesome. And that actually, economics-wise, you could build a bigger company for the same amount of money. So since I was pretty young and didn't have a lot of money, that was pretty important to me. So right about that time, DC actually got its first legal distillery, Catoctin Creek rye whiskey that some of you might be familiar with in Percyville, Virginia. I was working for an accounting company at the time. So they got like the best deal on accounting services, like 90% off. And any question they had, I would drive out there and explain it in person. And they eventually caught on to this. They're like, it was like a 2-second question and you scheduled a whole afternoon here. Yeah. So they were kind enough to teach me how to run a still if I would do a little bit of extra accounting work to help them. And accountants work like crazy between December 1st and April 15th. But you don't need most of us in July. So the company I worked for, you got some of your overtime as time and a half and some of your overtime as comp time. So I'd have like the whole month of July off. So I started going out to the West Coast and volunteering at places like Dry Fly and the distillery that's now AD Laws and Koval in Chicago. And it was early enough that I convinced some of these guys to let me work for them for free. And one of them, I even paid them for the privilege to work there for a month. But I was just really enjoying what I was doing. So we got to about 2012 and my boss started to become a real jerk. And I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. So I did the perfectly reasonable thing, quit my job, sold my house, cashed in my 401k, and moved into my parents' basement. They were thrilled. But I bought the still, and we put it where we are on Railroad Street in Rochester has been our original home. And the 350-gallon main still is the original piece of equipment. And what started out as just me and a couple of part-time staff has now grown to 63 employees. We distribute in 14 states. We export to Japan. And we'll make about 100,000 bottles of whiskey this year. So it's been quite a process. The 4-grain bourbon is what I started the company to make. I'm a bourbon Manhattan drinker. That is what I drink 90% of the time at home. And I found that wheated bourbons were sometimes a little too smooth. The maker's mark didn't have enough of a bite at the back. But then rye-based bourbons, sometimes the rye would overpower the bourbon. If you're going to drink rye, drink 90+% rye. I don't understand these 49 corn, 51 rye, 51 corn, 49 rye. Nobody can tell the difference in 2%. That's bogus to me. But in making these Manhattans, I found that it started being 2 ounces of bourbon, a half an ounce of straight rye whiskey, a little bit of maraschino cherry juice, and then my vermouth. And so I wanted to sort of eliminate one of those steps and get the rye into the wheated bourbon. And that's how we ended up with a mash bill of 60 corn, 20 wheat, 9 rye, and 11 malted barley. The rye we're using is Danko rye, so it's this huge, fat, plump kernel. We have to harvest it a little on the early side, or it'll actually fall over, and we have to be careful with that. But that 9% really comes through in the back part of the flavor profile. The other interesting thing, I learned to distill with both at Catoctin Creek and at Dry Fly Distilling. They run double pass distillation, so everything goes through the still twice. But when I was ordering my equipment, I knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to ask about some of the efficiency pieces. And so the equipment we bought was actually designed to do single pass distillation, straight from mash to finished product. So we now had a problem where I had spent like $100,000 on a piece of equipment that was tuned to the other end of the spectrum from what I needed. A little bit of a problem. So to compensate for that,
your accounting background, right?
Yeah.
That's the.
I'm
just move the numbers around.
Well, and I've got to be one of the. We're pretty easygoing, and we're happy to tell you when we screwed things up. So you will probably find several times in this hour I'll tell you things I just screwed up over the last 6 years. We're pretty open about it. We've also always found creative ways to fix it, and this is what's kind of unique. And also kind enough, you guys are going to give me 5 minutes to explain this part. Is I never get to tell this outside of the tours, because only people that really love bourbon care about this next process piece. But you're actually drinking a bourbon that, to the best of my knowledge, is made differently from all the rest of the bourbon on the planet. And it is merely because we're trying to correct for that screw up. But it lends itself, it ends up doing a really unique thing for us, and I'll tie it all back out at the end. So double pass distillation mashes on single pass distillation equipment. If you just run them straight through like the equipment's designed, you end up with light whiskey. The stuff's coming off at 180, 175. It's not bourbon legally, and it doesn't taste like bourbon. So how do we lower the proof? How do we get, that classic bourbon flavor that we want with equipment that is too efficient for what we're trying to do? So our equipment is sort of unique in that instead of having different pipes that you unscrew between the pot and the column, it has valves, 3-way valves that you can throw with a lever. And we found that if you just ran it as a pot still, you got really wide cuts, kind of dirty, whiskey didn't taste good. And if you ran it just as a column still, the proof was too high and there was not enough flavor. So we ended up figuring out this process where we take our heads cut in the column. So we get a really nice tight heads cut where all the methanol gets sectioned out, all the foreshots, etc. And we dump all that. But then as soon as we're done with our heads cut, we throw that valve at the top, and we no longer send the ethanol steam through the column, but rather we go straight across as just a straight pot still. And we run that for about 2.5 hours. So this is, no plates, heavy character, low ABV, just like thick corn whiskey, the way it would come out of the woods in the center of a run. But you get about 2.5 hours in and you start to get that characteristic bite that you would get from tails. You're only about halfway through the liquor. So the trouble is, if you were to cut it there, you end up with liquor that actually has like too much flavor. And you lose like half the liquor. You can't make a living doing that. So we go back into the column, restack those plates, and end up running for another about hour and a half of fairly refined 148, 149 proof whiskey coming out. So very light character, almost no corn flavor. Those two components are going into the same tank. So they're marrying right as they come off, and we can run another, again, couple hours before we have to get into our tails and cut the run wholly. But it means we end up with a ton of corn flavor, but none of the heads or tails that make the whiskey so rough. And it's one of the reasons why I believe our whiskey, for as young as it is, tastes as smooth and as flavorful as it does, because we're getting the best of both worlds. We get the cleanliness of a column still, but the flavor of just a straight pot still. And there's only probably about 50 stills in the country that you even could do that on, because again, you need the valves instead of the pipes, and the pipes are industry standard. And as far as I know, we're the only people that do it this way. So that was a long way of saying that's one of the things that makes us special. And it all comes because I wasn't smart enough to order the equipment quite right at the beginning. Happy accidents.
No, but I mean, it turned out that happy accident turned into a really cool backstory and just history of Black Button Distilling and the whiskey you guys are producing, because that's super unique. And
Yep.
that was one of the traits that we found as we picked this barrel too. It was just, it was a nice barrel, and I'd like to take a moment just to turn to some of our Patreon supporters and just get your thoughts on the whiskey itself, right? So that single barrel that we selected, what do you guys think of it so far as you crack it open and try it for the first or maybe second time?
It's amazing to drink at basically 115 proof. And it's so, my wife, Jordan, Nick, you met Kay when we went to New Riff. She just got up, she goes, it's incredibly smooth. And it is, it's amazing. I mean, Jordan or Jason, you put a lot of time and effort into this, and it sure has paid off to have 115 proof and no ice, no anything. It's congratulations. Good job, man.
It's got just the right amount of malt in it, and it just feels great in the mouth. It's got a great finish. I just opened the bottle tonight, and it's really good.
Thank you.
I'm just glad there's more accountants in the whiskey world. As somebody once told me, accounting is the best background to do anything but accounting.
Well, it kind of drives you to drink. So, I mean, I thought it was a natural.
No, I always tell people, they're like, well, how'd you get into bourbon? It's a family thing. I'm like, no, I grew up in a family where nobody drank. I said, I got into the alcohol business the traditional way, which is 10 years in public accounting. So that's Jason, I think you feel that same pain, and you were a little smarter to get out early.
I worked. It was interesting. The day I got hired, the guy that hired me he was a recruiter for the company. He said, in 3.5 years, you will not have this job. You will either have been promoted to section leader, you will have gone and worked for one of our competitors, or you will have left the industry never to return. I was, and literally he was only off by about 45 days for me. I did. I was out.
You took the ladder? Yeah.
Hey, Jason, kind of give us a little bit of the backstory on your barrel size and tell us about, your racks and how you have them stored and things like that. That would be interesting for us because it really is so good. How are you aging and what are you doing with the barrels?
So again, sort of the necessity being the mother of all invention. So in the early years, we stored everything in the distillery where we make everything, and it got to the point where actually to get to the fermenters, you would climb up over a rack of barrels and like army crawl your way like across the building, across the top of the barrels. And we finally decided we had too much. It was starting to become a safety issue. So we started looking around Rochester, where if you ever get to come visit, we are the definition of an urban distillery. We've got apartments to our left. We got a brewery to our right. The train tracks are behind us, and we front Railroad Street. There is no extra space at our site. So, there wasn't going to be an opportunity to just add on to the building. So we're looking around Rochester, and barrels are sort of unique that you really don't want them in conditioned space. You want the highs and the lows and the crazy weather we get in Rochester where you can have all 4 seasons in an afternoon. You want to bring that out. So we wanted somewhere safe and somewhere, out of the way, but we also honestly needed someplace pretty cheap. So I'm looking around and I end up finding this guy that's advertising a building for boat storage. And it's just a tin shack. It turns out it was an equipment storage building for a quarry. So it sits right on bedrock. It's got no water, no electric. The only garage door, you actually have to manually chain up. But I go out and talk to him. Originally, we're thinking of renting like the back half. And he's explaining how he's going to have different boats in and out, and maybe he'll build a wall out of plywood. I'm like, none of this is any good. Like, I can't have you having people store their boats like one sheet of plywood away from like $1 million worth of whiskey. What would it cost to just rent the whole thing? And we ended up coming to a number that works out to $3 a square foot. And if any of you have ever rented space, that is just obscenely cheap. But it's also obscenely shitty space for anyone else. But for us, it's perfect. It's out behind this old quarry. Nobody knows it's there. It has no anything to it. Again, no water, no electric. We have to drive to the McDonald's down the street to use the restroom. But it's a flat black metal building with no insulation. So if it's 90 degrees outside, it's 110 inside. And if it's 4 degrees outside, it's like -6 inside. The thing, again, it's right on bedrock, so we get a little bit of a temperature dampening in the winter from that. But we see a 120 degree temperature swing over the course of the year. And in the summer and like early spring, sometimes a 30 degree temperature swing every day. Now you probably ask yourself, how do we know that? We ended up buying these little temperature and humidity probes. We got like 24 of them around the building, because it's amazing where a barrel sits has a huge impact on how it ages. So the barrel's right by the door. Every time we throw open that door and we get big gusts of wind, the barrels are aging faster. The barrels back in the corner don't age half as fast. So we end up, as we're tasting the barrels, we're constantly moving them around. We have 36 rows going down left to right. And we're constantly moving them around from the front of the warehouse to the back of the warehouse, because you want the barrels to come out fairly even. I like bourbon that's very balanced. I don't want it to just be an oak bomb. I don't want it to just be spicy as hell. There is one bourbon that I buy that I only drink when I'm angry, because it burns all the way down. I don't make it, but and my wife jokes it's my angry bourbon. If I've had a bad day. When we're tasting them, we're trying to decide what else that barrel needs and where does it need to go. So this one would have spent the last 6 to 8 months of its life pretty close to that front door, because it was coming together very nicely, but we wanted a little more oak character and a little bit more sweet character. And again, you bring it closer to the door and it will get a few more of those characteristics. We're also very careful. We really try hard not to harvest whiskey between like December 10th, 1st, somewhere around there, and when the snow breaks in the spring, because we found that we don't get good harvests in January and February when it's so cold. The whiskey's like locked in that barrel, becomes a little tannic. There's something about those first 10 days of spring, the barrels just open way up and it's just way better. So we try to have everything we need in the warehouse by Thanksgiving to make it through the winter.
I gotta say, that's the first time I've heard anybody comment on that particular cycle, Jason. I think we picked a 15-gallon barrel. Actually, we had tasted 15 and 30. Talk about the different barrel sizes that you guys are using. I know I will say of late, we've actually found and stumbled on a lot of really great 15-gallon barrels, which I think like early on years ago didn't necessarily associate the smaller barrel with a really good whiskey, but actually now I'm kind of finding some of these that are cycling in these 15-gallon barrels are just absolutely fantastic. This being one of them. We did another pick earlier with Kings County Distillery, which was a 15-gallon, which was just a tremendous bourbon. Again, another New York State, so our home state of New York. So talk a little bit about that barrel size.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me is it's all about how long do you let it sit in the barrel, and every barrel has a window where, and it's unique to each individual barrel, but the windows are, you can somewhat predict it based on the size and the cooper. 15-gallon barrels, if we go back a couple years, even to Black Button, you go back to the early years and we were selling 15-gallon barrels at 12 months, 14 months. The cash flow of starting a new distillery is awful. And it just, you're trying to start a freight train from a stopped position. Jack Daniel's been doing this for 100 years. They've got, lots of stuff, coming and going all the time. When you're trying to start from barrel number one, you've got to turn that revenue over. And when we were putting those out, we were super happy with them. Like, we've never put anything out that we weren't super proud of. We've had times when we run out, but it's interesting as we get more attuned to it and we get more established. Sometimes we go back to some of our stuff from 5 years ago and we're like, yeah, no, I wouldn't put that out now. So I think that's where small barrels started to get a bad rap, was that people were trying to get them out too soon. And you've got to let those barrels get their time. Some of the chemical reactions really are time dependent. They're not going to change regardless of the barrel. And I also think it's how people treat their barrels. I think it's a lot harder. I think it'd be hard to get a almost 3-year-old 15-gallon barrel down in Texas where it's super hot for 6 months and super dry, whereas we're super cold for a good portion of the month, for a good portion of the year. And we're able to get more time in those smaller barrels. Our 15s are mostly coming from McGinnis and Barrel Mill. McGinnis being in Kentucky and Barrel Mill being up in Minnesota. They're both kiln-dried wood, nothing particularly fancy. A lot of the 30 we now pretty much exclusively buy from Adirondack Cooperage, which is in Rebson, New York, and still Barrel Mill. And it's interesting because the two barrels couldn't be more different. Barrel Mill, it's kiln-dried wood that's fresh out of the forest. It's water or steam bent, which generally is considered a less superior way of doing it. Whereas Adirondack, it's all air-dried wood that's 36 to 44 months old. They're fire bent. They're actually custom charred specifically for us. And what's interesting is that the Barrel Mill ones give us that more traditional hearty bourbon, like stocky winter bourbon. But the Adirondacks, they're taking longer to come of age, but when they do, the flavors are so much more subtle and nuanced, and there's a lot more sweet and spice and smoke. And we run about a 40-60 mix between those two, because we found for our normal blends, because we found that without it, it's hard to make a blend out of just one or two of those producers. So this one most likely would have been a Barrel Mill barrel. Again, kiln-dried wood. We get a lot of, really reliable barrels out of those guys. And we've worked with a lot of other coopers that, again, just didn't work for us. I know you mentioned Kings County. They pretty much exclusively use Black Swan. And I think the world of Heidi and her father, who run Black Swan Cooperage. I've spent hours on the phone with them about different tweaks and seen them at shows. And I can name 10 different whiskeys I love that come out of their barrels. Unfortunately, mine just isn't one of them. And after 3 years, we called them and, we broke up. We weren't mad at them. They hadn't done anything wrong. Just the way our whiskey comes off the still, their barrels ended up not meshing with our whiskey, and we couldn't go forward with them. And that's sort of an interesting thing because they're considered one of the preeminent barrel suppliers. Barrel Mill does not have the same quality reputation, and yet for our whiskey, we got a better result out of Barrel Mill than out of Black Swan, which is unusual. But again, each of the whiskeys is so different, and how you treat them in your climate is so different. I mean, again, the guys down in Texas where they're putting the barrels into shipping containers and they're getting up to 115, 125, 130 every day. I mean, I've been down to one of those places. You actually put your ear on the shipping container and you can hear the barrels cracking inside. And they're like baking the freaking whiskey in the barrel. And that's one of the cool things about craft distilling is that you're getting these regional variations. You can't make Texas style whiskey in New York. I mean, I guess if you like spend a ton of money with a climate controlled room and like forced it, but otherwise you just got to go there. And New York, it's the same thing. I mean, we regularly go weeks on end, not breaking the freezing point. You've got no moisture in the air. We get 22% losses in 3 years. Massive angel share. But the things that are evaporating in that cold winter air are those more volatile compounds, those things that you feel right here in the back that that Scotch takes 18 to 20 years to have come off because their weather's so constant. Kentucky takes 8 to 10. We're able to do a similar thing in 3 or 4 between what we do on the stills and what happens with our weather. So that was a long way of answering your question about barrels.
No, it was great, Jason. That was wonderful overview.
Yeah.
Great.
I love talking about this stuff. So anything you guys want to know, I'm an open book.
I want to know if I show up on January the 4th, can I work for free for a couple months?
Why don't we try more like June 4th? Because I think it's going to be a pretty rough winter up here.
Yeah, I agree.
But once we can have the doors open again, we can talk. We've done that a couple times. We used to actually do a formal school where we actually taught 10 to 15 distillers a year in like a week-long one-on-one class setting. But once Moonshine University really got going, we found that we were getting busier and that folks were more interested in the group classes that were being offered down there. And as we started to have less students, we eventually turned it off because it also just took a ton of time. But I think there's 7 distilleries in Buffalo. 3 of them graduated from our class, and all 5 of the distillers in Syracuse graduated from our class. So at one point, somebody was picking on me about that. They're like, "You're training all your competitors." I'm like, hey, they're paying for the time. So
Well, you couldn't be a better teacher. You've got a real good handle on the entire process. It's been interesting to watch the evolution of everything you've tried to do. It's great.
it helps when you really love what you're doing. So
Yeah, and you do.
And Jason, as you continue to grow, one of the other areas that you focus on still is producing vodka and gin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will that still remain to be a staple part of your business as you continue to expand and just get more time in at Black Button? Or do you envision eventually just moving solely to whiskey and maybe cutting out one of those 2 spirits, or maybe expanding into even a different spirit line too?
So it's hard. It's always hard to predict the future. For us, if you'd asked me the day I started, I would have told you we planned to be 30% vodka, 30% gin, 30% bourbon, 10% other stuff. Boy, did that not happen. We're about 2% vodka, and if that got no higher, I would not be offended at all. It's not what I drink. We don't, again, our equipment can do it, but it actually takes 30 hours to make 1,000 bottles of vodka, whereas it only takes 8 hours to make 1,000 bottles of whiskey, plus a few years of aging. But so neither myself nor my business partner really enjoy vodka. I mean, luckily we don't have to do it straight anymore. We originally actually didn't know how to cut into the runs. So it was 30 hours straight. Him and I would take shifts through the night. Those were long days. So I don't see the vodka part growing. Gin, what I love about gin is that you can do real R&D real quickly. We have a 200 liter still, so we make about 200 bottles in that. We can try stuff, and if we're wrong, we'll strip the flavor out of it with the vodka column and try it again. And you can't really do that with whiskey. I mean, every year we do a couple of weird things. We've done a 5-grain bourbon. We've done a high rye bourbon, a just wheated bourbon. We've played around with yeasts. We've played around with fermentation temperatures. But to really know how that worked out, you have to make the batch, leave it in the warehouse, and come back 3 years later. And then you taste it and you think about it and you go to do something else. But that's a really long research and development cycle. And some of them don't go that well. Like we did a yeast trial 4 years ago, and honestly, the stuff is not drinkable. And it's the same recipe, same fermentation, same distillation. And like, honestly, it's like the worst day of the year when I have to taste those 12 barrels because they're just nasty. Now, I keep holding out this weird hope that like when they get to like 10 years, they'll somehow have like turned around and they're just not ready yet. My business partner thinks I'm out of my mind and that we should just 86 them. But yeah, I mean, that the gin for me, it allows you a level of creativity that's harder to do with whiskey. And you have that, again, that cash turn piece. I mean, every time we get extra money, I joke that making bourbon is like a bad mistress because every time you have an extra $1,000, it goes to her. And, you know, we always want to make more barrels of bourbon, and we're always constrained by how much cash we have. So the nice part about gin is I can make it today. I can have it. I can go from thinking about it to selling it in 6 weeks. And honestly, a lot of the money from the gin keeps the lights on and goes back to making whiskey. We constantly get asked about brandy, being right on top of the Finger Lakes, knowing so many wineries. You know, we run brandy probably 2 weeks a year, mostly on contract for those wineries. If we were going to open another spirit side, it would probably be that. But I've started to recognize that there's really big differences between fruit distillation, grain distillation, and rum. You know, it was, I don't know, around year 2 or 3, I was like, yeah, we know how to distill. We figured this out. We'll make some rum. We'll order some molasses, mix it with some hot water. How hard could it be? And I found out it's a lot harder than I thought. There's just so many nuances and so many different ways you said it. It's sort of like, you know, I mean, even like chefs. I mean, you can be a great chef, but if you're classically trained in like French cooking, you're probably not going to go work a corn dog stand. Not that you can't, and not to imply that rum is the corn dog in this scenario, but, you know, like if you cook French, you cook French. If you cook Italian, you cook Italian. If you're a sushi guy, you cook sushi. I feel blessed that we figured out how to really nail like 2 of them, gin and bourbon, both being, again, grain-based spirits. But adding a third one to our repertoire, you start to run out of time and mental capacity.
Fair enough. That was a good background. Thanks. And then one more question for you, talking about different, same spirits that you guys already make, right? But with New York State really solidifying Empire Rye as being its own category, right? And you guys already do an Empire Rye, but how do you envision that really accelerating just the focus on New York State ryes, right? The Empire Rye classification. So
I was there the night that Empire Rye really was born. It was at the American Craft Spirits Association. There were 8 of us, New York distillers, sitting around after the award show. And Christopher Williams at Copper Sea had been kicking around this idea, brought it to us, and we all agreed we'd throw in the money to make it happen. And it's really interesting because it's almost like historical reenactment style, while also trying to have enough flexibility that you can make a living at it. We had long arguments about whether you should be allowed to use enzymes in your mashing, because there were folks that thought that we should go no enzyme, and those of us that like wanted to be able to sell a bottle for less than $150 and break even. So we worked it all out. The project really was kind of a secret. I mean, it was an open secret, but everybody, we worked out the rules. Everybody went and made some, and then we waited 2.5 years because we wanted everything to be minimum 2 years old. And then when it came out, it ended up, being in the New York Times and being this huge hit. Our Empire Rye always sells out. And again, back to that crystal ball idea, I would have made a lot more of it that first year if I'd known we were going to be in the New York Times. It's a really cool style. It's really neat, again, to see these regional styles coming up. I hear that Maryland and Pennsylvania are working on a similar set of rules. And I think someday you're going to be able to sit there and have a Kentucky rye, a Pennsylvania rye, a Maryland rye, and a New York rye, and appreciate the differences in all of them. Ours is a very traditional high rye, minimum aging requirement. It all has to be New York. A lot of that trying to keep people from just buying MGP and calling it New York. I've got some great friends that run some great brands with sourced whiskey. I don't have a problem with it. I just like when people are honest. I think Barrel, 2 R's, 2 L's, I think they do it incredibly well. They're very upfront. This is great juice. We didn't make it. We blend like crazy. Hope you enjoy it. But all of us, up here in New York, get a little prickly when folks are like, oh, let me show you this New York made spirit that was distilled in Indiana. And I'm sure a few of you know what brands I'm probably thinking of. So again, trying to keep it to where you really did have to make it right in New York to call it that. And so far, it's been a huge success. We've done a number of, again, trials. There's enough variation. Ours is 94% rye, 6% malted barley. A friend of mine makes one where it's 100% rye and he malts 10% of the rye. There's just some really cool things coming out that, again, give you still diversity in the category, but a common theme. And I honestly think the minimum age requirement is helpful too. I'm mostly a live and let live, but if I could change one thing about the liquor laws, it would be that the age statements had to be more clearly stated. Because I do think it's, especially craft, there's good whiskey that gets made in 6 months. But you should be telling people how young it is, and they should be able to decide for themselves whether that's something they want to try. And age isn't everything, but a lot of whiskey's a lot better after 2 or 3 years than it was before 2 years. And especially the bigger those barrels get, not to jump back to our barrel discussion earlier, we've been making 53-gallon barrels for 6.5 years now, and none of them have come of age yet. We've got a couple that are almost ready, and we think for their 7th birthday they'll be ready. But that was our level of commitment to the idea that we would never release something too early. If we were going to have 2-year-old whiskey, it had to be in those 10s and 15s so that it was ready. And it looks like for us, 53s are going to take 7 to 8 years. So something exciting coming. But I think that, I think the regional styles are just going to continue to grow. And you're starting to see some of the same thing in rum. Barbados just passed a similar set of rules, or if you want to call it Barbados rum, it's got to meet certain criteria. I think all of that's a great thing to help consumers delineate really high quality products.
Hey Jason, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Just going back to the barrels and the sort of background on the barrels. Was that issue, I think you called them Black Swan. Mm-hmm. Was that issue is that what led to the double barrel bourbon? So
it wasn't them, but it was a similar issue. And I'm glad you brought that one up. It's another fun, boy, did Jason almost screw this up in a big way. So, you walk into this barrel warehouse, there's like 2,000 barrels aging. Minuscule compared to like if you go to Buffalo Trace. But for us, it's a lot of whiskey. And you walk in, you take a deep breath, and it smells great. But sometimes it smells too good. And that's never a good day. So I walk in one morning, and the wafting of whiskey is way more than normal. Something's leaking. So I start walking through the rows, and I find a barrel, and it's a barrel we'd only filled maybe 3 months beforehand, and it has totally split open. It's empty. You can pick it up with like one hand. Crap. Yeah, I'm out $2,000. But then I realized it came in with 25 other barrels from a brand new cooperage we'd only used once. And as I start to move some of them with the equipment, they're all starting to fray. So I got to get the whiskey out of these barrels before I lose another $10,000-$20,000. So we immediately set up the trough that we use for harvesting. We load all the barrels into it, and we call the supplier. And we did finally figure out what was wrong. When you fire bend barrels, you have to do it over a very small fire for a very long period of time so that the wood sets that curve. If you do it too hot and too fast, the wood, the curve doesn't stay. And so you've got like internal pressure on those fibers. And as they heat and cool over time, they rip. And literally you're talking about a stave of whiskey or a stave of a barrel like ripping itself open like a wound. So we've got all these barrels into a tank. They're nowhere near done because they're only like 90 days old. So we get in new barrels from a different cooperage. We never bought from the original guy again. And we put them into barrels, and anytime something happens, we mark what happened. We take a lot of notes. Because you never, like, if something did happen, what can we learn from that? How can we do that better? And just if it is weird, why? Because we've had another, I'll tell you about Frankenbrew in a minute. So we end up loading all these into new barrels. I figure, hey, 90 days in one barrel, a couple years in a second barrel, they'll be pretty similar, right? But they already had a lot of color. And when we went and tasted them 2 years later when they were done, I was amazed how much extra oak that original 90 days in those breaking barrels ended up giving to them. So we couldn't just blend it into the normal bourbon. And what do you do when you've got something unique that you can't blend into normal bourbon? You come out with a new label. So I think there were 11 of those barrels. We've harvested 7 of them so far, so there should be 4 more of those. And at this point, we tend to harvest them one at a time as single barrels. So
all of the breaking bourbon guys, their ears just perked up when they heard the words of breaking barrels. The innuendos just started flowing. They're like, okay, note to self, ask Jason after a couple drinks about how we get.
Is the domain name available?
Yeah, it's breaking bad.
Hey, I just have two other quick
Jordan,
questions.
don't let us down.
I just have 2 other quick questions, if that's okay. I'm curious, back to the barrels, what level of char you use?
So we're running right about a 3.5. The Adirondack ones are interesting. They actually char on a machine that was built for the Scotch industry to re-char barrels. So they're one of the only folks in the world that use it to char new barrels, and they do that low, slow fire bending over an open flame. So they get a really deep toast layer. It's actually considerably thicker into the barrel than normal. But then the actual char happens very quickly. A normal air compressed char would run about 35 seconds to level 3. This only takes about 13 seconds. Because again, it's that propane lance, but they're actually able to measure the temperatures right inside. And through some trial and error with them, we developed a profile that it runs in that 13 seconds. That's a little thicker, a little deeper than normal, but also lets a lot more of the vanillins and caramels in the wood come out. So it's about a 3.5 is the easy way to describe it.
Cool. All right. Last question. Sorry to.
No, you're fine. I'm
Go for it.
happy to keep talking about this stuff.
Great. Thanks. I'm new to your distillery, and I was just doing a little reading and research, and I saw that other than the cask strength, all the other bourbons are sort of on the lower end of the proof scale. And I'm just kind of curious what went into that decision. Is it just sort of approachability for the masses, or was there something else that went into that decision?
So mostly it's that I tend to drink bourbon without ice. So I tend to just drink it straight out of a Glencairn glass. Again, make plenty of it into Manhattans on cold winter nights. But when we were getting started, I just found that the 84s, 86 range was very approachable. And Rochester's a very food smart town, but New York sort of gets the short end of the stick on the whiskey side of things. We don't get much of the allocations. We're kind of far away from Kentucky. Obviously not as far as like California or something, but we have we want to make sure that our whiskey is very approachable to whiskey lovers and non-whiskey lovers alike. We tend to if we're doing a single barrel and we're not doing it at cask strength, we do tend to harvest that at the 92 range. Because again, we found that folks that are buying single barrels that are a little more into bourbon appreciate it in that more 90, 92 range. But for our average consumer, I mean, we get a lot of people where they don't really drink bourbon, but they like our bourbon. And that just gives us that wider demographic. But it all started from the fact that I just wanted whiskey I could drink. I go camping a lot. I spend a lot of time out in the woods. So not a lot of ice. So I needed whiskey I could just drink, straight from a cup.
Perfect.
And my wife, for my birthday 2 years ago, found these. Basically, they're metal. They're shaped kind of like the Glencairn glasses, but they're metal. Because I broke like 6 of them over the years on various camping trips.
Of course.
And she was like, "Yo, stainless steel, no more."
That's cool. Thanks.
Yeah. No, happy to. What other questions do we have about Black Button or bourbon or any of the strange stuff we do? Or you guys want me to tell you about Frankenbrew? That was another one of our weird ones.
Yeah.
So we've got this big.
Before we wrap up,
We've got 3 Halloweens ago. It was 3 years ago. So we have these big silos out back full of the corn and the wheat, and we auger them into the mash kettle. In the early years, it was all 55-pound bags. But 20 of those a day starts to be a little more of a workout than you're looking for. We still use 8 of them now with the rye and the malted barley are still in those, but the corn, again, we use the auger. Well, the auger goes into a weigh station, and when it hits the right weight, it turns off, and then you open a slide at the bottom, and it all just drops in through gravity, and another cycle sets. Well, my business partner, and we've both made plenty of mistakes over the years, so I'm not knocking him. But he had closed the slide, but only closed it like 75% of the way. Then he walked away. So the hopper's starting to fill, but the grain is sliding out the end right into the mash cooker. So it's never filling. It's not stopping. It just keeps dumping more and more and more corn into the mash kettle. And he's gone for like, 10, 15 minutes before he goes back over there and, oh shit, So we've got no idea how much corn is in this thing. It's way thicker than it should be. The mash pedals are struggling to turn. But the only way to get it out of there is to brew it and push it into a fermenter. And even getting it to push into a fermenter required lots of extra water. I mean, this thing was just a mess. We're just trying to get it out of the equipment. But we put it, we finally get it thin enough. It'll move into the fermenters. A single mash, which usually fills 1 fermenter, is now spread across like 4 because it's this weird. We don't know how much grain is in there. We don't know how much water is in there. But we end up letting it ferment because, hey, why not? We run it through the still, and we get about 100 proof gallons out of a fermenter is a normal day for us. So we're running the first one of these fermenters, and we get to 100, we get to 110, we get to 120, and we get to 130, and the ethanol just keeps coming off the still. And we've got 4 of these things. So across 4 fermenters, we end up just with this massive, like 600 proof gallons out of a single cook that should normally net you like 200. But again, way too much corn, and then it was all watered down, and it's just all over the place. So we distill it off. We throw it into some barrels because, again, We got it. What else are you going to do with it? And we label it Frankenbrew. We come back to it a couple years later, and it's definitely bourbon because it's almost all corn. It's definitely not our 4-grain because we didn't get the wheat or the rye into it. But it's just got this really neat, like creme brulee, vanilla custard, weird thing going on. And it was like the whiskey that just wouldn't end because it just kept coming out of these stills. So I think there might be 1 or 2 more of those kicking around. You might want to ask Alex if he's got any samples of those. It was just one of the weirdest days because, again, here a mistake had turned into a really neat thing. And I asked my business partner if he thought we could recreate it. Do we have any idea like what the mash bill was? And unfortunately, the answer is no. He has offered to try, kind of roughing it in. And I was like, what would that then be? Son of Frankenbrew? Like, yeah, what are we gonna call that? So we've had some fun times along the years.
That's awesome. That seems like a few special barrels and definitely a good story that you guys will have for the rest of the time to tell.
Yes.
So as we come up on, the hour, just wanted to really wrap this up and say, Jason, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us. It was a blast picking the barrel from Black Button. I think everyone's enjoyed it that's sampled it so far. Really enjoyed all your stories. Really enjoyed getting to learn more about the distiller. It's been super interesting, that's for sure. And we're looking forward to seeing what you guys do in the coming years, especially as you start releasing, those larger barrel sizes that hit that 7-year plus mark.
Yep.
And Blank, as always, great having you on. It's always good having representation, having Sealbox available to meet everyone's whiskey's needs, which is really great. And to all of our patrons who are able to join this chat, we really thank you for your support and really thanks for getting exposed to Black Button with us. It's been really fun getting to know this brand more and getting taste through those barrels. So we've really enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys continue to enjoy your bottles too. And then the 3 of us at Breaking Bourbon just wanted to say thanks to all those watching. We look forward to bringing you some more great barrels through our Patreon Single Barrel Club and wishing everyone an upcoming safe and happy holidays. So we'll be talking again soon. I'm going to end the broadcast live. But thanks so much, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we had a great time. Thanks, Jason. We appreciate it.